It's roughly 70,000 years ago. You're crouched at the edge of a shallow grave, and the person in it was your mother. You dug this with your hands. You placed her body carefully, knees folded to her chest, facing east, the direction the sun comes from every morning. You don't know why east specifically. Nobody told you to do it that way. It just felt right. It felt like the correct thing to do for someone who is no longer here, but also, somehow, not entirely gone. You lay a handful of red ochre across her body, that deep rust-colored pigment you've been grinding from stone for weeks. You don't have a word for ritual. You don't have a word for afterlife, but you have a feeling, somewhere in the chest, that this matters, that if you don't do this correctly, something bad will follow. And then you back away from the grave facing forward, so you can keep your eyes on it. Not out of grief, out of fear. That is not superstition. That is not stupidity. That is the beginning of something that would eventually become every religion, every funeral tradition, every ghost story ever told. And it started right here, in the dirt, with someone who looked almost exactly like you. So, what did ancient humans actually think happened when someone died? And why? Across every culture, every continent, every era of human prehistory, were they so specifically, so consistently, so deeply afraid that the dead might come back? The short answer is, they thought death was a transition, not an ending. The long answer is what this whole video is about, and it gets stranger, more fascinating, and honestly, a little more embarrassing than you'd expect. Here's the thing about death that your ancestors had to work out without any help from a priest, a philosopher, or a Wikipedia article. One day, a person is there. They are warm, they breathe. They argue with you about who gets the better cut of the mammoth. They laugh at things. They remember things. They are, unmistakably, a person. And then, in a matter of hours, they are a thing. They are still physically present, lying right there, but whatever made them them has clearly left. The body remains, the person does not. This is the original cognitive puzzle of humanity. And your ancestors, being the same species as you with the same brain architecture and the same hunger for explanations, could not just shrug and walk away from it. Researchers who study the cognitive evolution of religion, people like Pascal Boyer at Washington University, who spent decades mapping how the human mind generates supernatural beliefs, argue that the concept of a soul, or a spirit, wasn't invented by priests in a temple somewhere. It emerged naturally, spontaneously, from the way the human brain processes the disappearance of a person. We are wired, Boyer's research suggests, to think of bodies and minds as two separate things. Psychologists call this intuitive dualism. You don't learn it, you arrive with it. Even very young children, in cross-cultural studies, spontaneously treat the mind as something that can exist separately from the body. The brain sees a dead body and thinks, okay, the body is here, so where did the rest of them go? That question, where did they go, is the seed of every ghost story ever told. Let that sit with you for a second. Now here's where it gets fascinating, because we don't have to speculate entirely. We have evidence. Physical, dug out of the ground evidence that ancient humans were doing something deliberate with their dead long before they had writing, agriculture, cities, or anything we'd recognize as civilization. The site of School Cave in Israel, excavated and studied extensively since the 1930s, contains intentional burials dating back approximately 100,000 years. Not bodies that were dumped or abandoned, bodies that were placed, positioned, sometimes with grave goods, a boar's jaw tucked under one individual's arm, ochre pigment scattered deliberately. Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq pushed things even further. In 1960, archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated a Neanderthal burial site, Neanderthals, not even our direct species, and found what appeared to be pollen clusters around the bodies, suggesting flowers had been placed in the grave. This finding has been debated for decades. Some researchers think the pollen was carried there by animals or wind. Others argue the pattern is too deliberate to dismiss. Either way, what nobody disputes is that these individuals were deliberately, carefully buried, not left where they fell. Neanderthals were doing something with their dead 60,000 years ago that implies, at minimum, An awareness that the dead were different from discarded objects, that they warranted effort. They weren't stupid. They were asking the same question you ask. And then, around 40,000 years ago, what archaeologists sometimes call the behavioral revolution, something shifted. The burials became more elaborate. Red ochre appears constantly. Ornaments, beads made from shell or bone, sometimes placed in positions that suggest they were sewn into clothing the dead person was buried in. In Sunghir, Russia, 2 children buried roughly 34,000 years ago were found covered in more than 10,000 hand-carved ivory beads. 10,000, each one carved individually. Researchers estimate it would have taken thousands of hours of labor. That is not a disposal of a body. That is a statement about what the dead person still was, even in death. So what exactly did they think happened? This is where we have to be careful, because we obviously can't interview a person from 40,000 years ago. But anthropologists have done the next best thing. They've studied the belief systems of indigenous and traditional cultures worldwide that have maintained relatively continuous cultural traditions, and they've looked for patterns that appear too consistently to be coincidence. And one pattern shows up everywhere, across cultures as geographically distant as Aboriginal Australians, the Huichol of Mexico, the San people of Southern Africa, and dozens of groups across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The dead are not assumed to simply stop. They are assumed to continue, to exist in some adjacent state, still aware, still present, still capable of interacting with the living. The anthropologist E.B. Tylor called this animism in 1871, the baseline belief that everything, including the dead, has a spirit or essence that persists. He thought it was the earliest form of religion, and most contemporary researchers still broadly agree with him on that, even if they've refined the framework considerably. But here's the part that's genuinely interesting. The dead weren't just assumed to persist, they were assumed to persist close by. In many early belief systems, reconstructed from burial archaeology, cave art, and the earliest written religious texts, the newly dead were thought to linger near their bodies, near their graves, near the places they lived. Not in some distant heaven or underworld yet. Here, right here, in the camp, near the fire, in the dark just past the edge of the torchlight. And that is where the fear comes in. Let's be honest with ourselves for a second, because this is the part of the video where we have to stop and reckon with something. The fear of the dead, what researchers sometimes call thanatophobia in its cultural form, is not just a quirky historical footnote. It was, in many prehistoric communities, the organizing principle of how you handled a death. Every ritual, every grave good, every careful placement of the body, a significant chunk of it was not about honoring the dead. It was about managing them, about making sure they stayed where you put them. Think about what a nightmare a vengeful dead person would be in a world without electric lights, without locks on doors, without any way to call for help. You're sleeping in a group of maybe 30 people. One of them just died, maybe in pain, maybe angry, maybe with unfinished grievances against specific people in the group. And now, according to the framework your entire community shares, that person is still around, still capable of making things happen, and possibly still carrying those grievances. The proper funeral wasn't just grief, it was containment. Across dozens of prehistoric and early historic burial sites, archaeologists have found evidence of what they now call deviant burials. Bodies buried face down, bodies with heavy stones placed on top of them, bodies with limbs removed or bound. At a site in Drosko, Poland, dating to the 17th century, but following burial traditions with roots going back much further, researchers found individuals buried with sickles across their necks, the blade positioned so that if the body tried to rise, it would be decapitated. In other sites across Eastern Europe, bodies were found with stones placed in their mouths, which researchers interpret as a way to prevent the dead from speaking or calling out. These were not people who were afraid of death. These were people who were afraid of the dead. There is a very important difference, and it maps almost perfectly onto what cognitive scientists would predict. Because here's what's happening in the human brain during all of this. A thing called the agency detection system, our evolved tendency to assume that unexplained events have a conscious cause, is running at full power in a world full of unexplained events. A child gets sick 3 days after a respected elder dies. The crops fail. A hunting party returns empty-handed. The rain stops. In a world without germ theory, without meteorology, without any of the explanatory frameworks we take for granted, the recently dead person with unfinished business is a very reasonable explanation. And once you believe that, the funeral becomes the most important thing you do all year. Now, and this is the part I want you to sit with for a moment, once you understand the fear, the rituals start to look completely rational. Red ochre, that rust-colored pigment that appears in burials across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe for at least 100,000 years, it's the color of blood. It's the color of life. In many interpreted frameworks, it was placed on the dead to simulate vitality, to trick the spirit into feeling cared for and complete, so it wouldn't feel the need to come back and take what it lacked from the living. Grave goods, the beads, the tools, the food offerings placed in graves, were almost certainly, at least in part, a practical transaction. You're giving the dead person what they need for wherever they're going, but you're also giving them what they might otherwise come back to get. You're settling the account before they leave. The positioning of bodies, facing east, facing the sunrise, appears in burial sites across multiple continents. East is where the sun is reborn every morning. The dead person is pointed toward the source of resurrection, the original daily miracle that your ancestors watched with genuine awe every single morning of their lives. And the practice of backing away from a grave while keeping your eyes on it? That one is documented in ethnographic records across multiple cultures. You don't turn your back on a fresh grave, not because of a superstition, because the belief system says there's something in that grave that can see you, and turning your back on it is an invitation. Here's what's genuinely remarkable. These behaviors emerged independently, across cultures that had no contact with each other, across tens of thousands of years. That is not coincidence. That is something built into the operating system. Here's the gut punch moment of this whole story, and I'm going to play it straight. In 2013, a team of archaeologists excavating a site called Cône de l'Arago in southern France, a site occupied by early humans for hundreds of thousands of years, found something in the deepest, oldest layers of occupation. Among the stone tools and animal bones and the accumulated evidence of countless ordinary lives, they found what appeared to be a deliberately modified human skull, approximately 400,000 years old. 400,000 years old. That is twice as old as our own species. The skull showed signs of having been defleshed after death, carefully, deliberately, in a way that is distinct from the marks left by animal scavengers, and it appeared to have been kept, curated, not discarded. We don't know why. We genuinely do not know. But the most widely accepted interpretation among paleoanthropologists is that whoever these people were, some early Homo species, possibly Homo heidelbergensis, not yet fully modern humans, they were doing something with the skull of a dead individual that went beyond practicality. They were preserving a piece of a person, a representative of someone who was no longer there. Which means the question, where did they go, is at least 400,000 years old. Let that sit with you. Your instinct to wonder what happens after death is not a product of religion. It's not a product of culture or language or civilization. It predates all of those things by hundreds of thousands of years. The ghost story is not a story someone invented. It's the default output of a human mind, or near-human mind, confronted with the disappearance of a person. You were built to ask this question. You were built to be unsettled by the answer. And every candle you've ever lit for a dead person, every grave you've ever stood over, every time you felt the specific, quiet unease of being in a place where someone died, that goes all the way back. All the way to the dirt and the fire and the careful, frightened hands backing away from a grave in the dark. So here's where we land. Death, the fact of it, the mystery of it, the specific social problem of what to do with a person who is no longer a person, was the first hard question humanity ever had to answer. And the answer your ancestors came up with, before language was fully developed, before the first cave painting was scratched into stone, was this: they're still here. And we have to manage that carefully. Every funeral tradition in the world, from the most elaborate state ceremony to the simplest burial in a backyard, is a descendant of that answer. every ghost story, every concept of heaven and hell and purgatory and the underworld, every candle lit for the dead, every offering placed at a grave, every moment of silence at a memorial. All of it traces a direct line back to a group of humans crouched in the dark, 70,000 years ago, trying to figure out what to do about the person who was just there and is now not. The remarkable thing isn't that they were afraid. The remarkable thing is what they did with the fear. They built something with it, a framework, a set of practices, a shared story that said, this matters, this person mattered, and the way we handle this says something about who we are. That instinct, to make death mean something, is one of the most distinctly human things about you. Or it's much older than human, and that might be even more interesting. There's a question I want to leave you with, and I'd genuinely love to see your answer in the comments. If you could go back, not to the mammoth hunts or the cave paintings, or any of the things we usually romanticize about prehistoric life, but just to be there, at one of these early funerals, to watch the ochre go down, to see the grave goods being placed, to feel the atmosphere of 30 people gathered in the dark around someone they've just lost, doing the best they can with a mystery that has no solution. Would you want to be there? Because I think about it a lot, and I think it would feel a lot less foreign than we'd expect. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.